All right, Maggie, this next question is for you. A man and a woman can get drunk, stumble into each other in Las Vegas, get married, and instantly gain access to benefits and rights, but two men or two women who have known and loved each other for decades are barred from that privilege. So why isn't that discriminatory?
The privilege of getting drunk, going to Las Vegas, and entering into a relationship.
I was gearing that more toward the benefits and rights.
Okay, all right. I actually don't think, I think if this were a debate about benefits and rights, fundamentally, it would be a different debate. There are many forms of rights that I would not have a problem with. I think it's terrible if gay people are not allowed to see people they love in the hospital. What I've observed is, and I'm not sure it's true here in Pennsylvania, but we've now reached a point that if you offer all of the rights and benefits of marriage, as they did in California, and yet you try to draw the line around marriage itself, you still get the charge that you're like Jim Crow, you're like a racist, if you oppose same-sex marriage. And what that is a clue to is that we're in, we have a fundamental moral debate here about two different visions of the good, which is, can't be resolved by the question of benefits and rights. But let me note this. If you really believe that people like me who think marriage is the union of husband and wife, and I don't matter, by the way, I'm just one person, but you're talking now about millions of your fellow Americans, you really think we're like racists who oppose interracial marriage, you can't then say that same-sex marriage isn't going to have any consequences for people. Because the law powerfully intervenes to repress, marginalize, and stigmatize, both in culture and legally, racists in this country. So I do think that you have to choose in common honesty. If that's your position, that our marriage tradition is evil because it's akin to racism, then the people, the millions of Americans who continue to believe, whether it's rooted in Genesis or common sense, that marriage is the union of husband and wife and that there are good reasons for distinguishing these kinds of unions, we're going to end up finding that the government is going to impose on us in a variety of ways. And we're already seeing that begin to happen very early in this process. So I would say that if that's your moral position, I disagree with it. I think you're wrong about your friends and neighbors and fellow citizens, as well as wrong about marriage. But you can't say on the one hand, this is why I'm for gay marriage, this is what gay marriage means, and it's not going to affect anyone else, so why should you care?
Buttle?
First of all, thank you. I just want to reply to a couple of things that Maggie said about interracial marriage not being the same thing, the bans on interracial marriage. First of all, it wasn't something that was imposed by the political class. In fact, a lot of people say we should vote on whether or not same-sex couples should have the right to marry. My view is that a right is not a right if the majority can take it away by voting on it. But the fact is that if you believe we should vote on whether or not people can choose their mate, you believe that Loving versus Virginia, which is the case that struck down the anti-miscegenation laws, was wrongly decided. Because they did vote, and they repeatedly said in some states that blacks and whites could not marry each other. The Supreme Court says we do not vote on fundamental rights. But I would say, to Maggie's point, that for them being so different, the arguments for both keeping blacks and whites from marrying and keeping gay people from marrying them are eerily similar. If not virtually identical. They basically fall into, my God doesn't like it, it's not natural, there's a slippery slope, and other things are going to have to be allowed if we allow that, and the kids are going to be hurt. I mean, it's the same exact arguments we hear. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but I don't think so. I would also say that if Maggie does support the gay people having all the rights of married couples, then, but without calling it marriage, that would be progress. I don't think enough, but that would be progress. But then I assume she supports repeal of DOMA. The Defense of Marriage Act, the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, is not about preventing same-sex marriage at all. Marriage is a state law issue. What it's about is preventing same-sex couples from receiving federal benefits. 100% it's about that. So if I were to die, my wife would get my Social Security benefits. This is one of hundreds, incidentally. But if my partner, if I was a gay person, would get nothing, despite the fact we'd been together for 30 years and that we'd raised a family and all of that, they would get nothing. So if Maggie would lend her voice to repealing DOMA, that would be a huge help, I can promise you. Finally, on the issue of whether there are consequences to gay people, to denying gay people the right to marry, again, I would point to what Maggie said in her book. This is what Maggie said are the consequences of people, what she called, I guess, shacking up or living together as unmarried. And this is the list of consequences: poverty, welfare dependence, child abuse, substance abuse, physical illness, infant mortality, suicide, juvenile delinquency, educational failure, conduct disorders, and high taxes. I was a little confused about the high taxes part, but you know,
He's
those
not
are
quoting me, by the way. He's summarizing.
no, I'm
something.
summarizing.
These
That's
are
fair.
not quotes. Yeah.
That's fair. But I do think it's fair to say, is it not, that you have said repeatedly that people who do not marry, in the context of heterosexual couples, people who do not marry suffer grave consequences. You've written whole books about that, and I thought they were very good books. And what I'm saying is, are you denying that those same consequences occur to gay people if they are unable to marry?
No, actually, there's no evidence. The book that I wrote, The Case for Marriage, was not just Maggie kind of rummaging around in her mind and trying to come up with some things. It was actually based on several decades of social science evidence about marriages between men and women. And I actually do not think that there is much good evidence. And in fact, there's a preliminary study on civil unions in Vermont. I don't think it's going to have the same effect for gay people for a number of complex reasons. But the simplest reason is that the gay community is supporting marriage primarily as an individual right, not as a social norm. It's not at all clear that gay people believe you ought to get married before you, as a community, that you ought to get married before you have children. It's not clear that children of gay couples will benefit if their parents marry. Because I'll tell you frankly, the research on the ways that children benefit points strongly that the benefit comes from getting the child's own mother and father in a stable, decent, good enough marriage. Okay, so that your parenting relationships aren't subdivided by the children that get created in more temporary liaisons. Step families can be wonderful. They can also be difficult. The bottom line is, if marriage itself is a legal structure where what we're creating the benefits to children, then children living in remarried families should do better than children being raised by solo mothers. And they don't on average. They don't. So I think that one of the great problems in our country is that we have so much family fragmentation, so much fatherlessness. 40% of our children are born outside of wedlock. Close to half of new marriages end in divorce. And there are consequences for everyone from that reality. It's precise. I spent 15 years going around the country trying to do something about what I consider the larger marriage crisis. It came out of my experience. For 10 years, I was an unwed mother. So in the middle of the 80s celebrations of what great progress it was for women, that we have so many collapsing families and that our marriage culture is in collapse, I had a lot of personal experience with what it was actually like. And that is what led me into the work I did for 15 or 20 years before I entered the same-sex marriage debate. And the reason that I think it matters, to me, these are not separate or contradictory things. This is the same thing. What I did is I went around the country and I pointed to all the ways that I said, marriage really matters because children need a mom and a dad. And adults have an obligation to make serious sacrifices to get that good for their children. And what we have here now is an attempt to redefine marriage so that this ideal is just stripped from marriage in law. That if you go out now, and I promise you, this is not theoretical, if you go out and you say unions of husbands and wife are special because children need a mom and a dad, you get called a hateful bigot. Right? I don't need future evidence that this is going to be hard on the idea that the ideal for a child is a mother and father. We are witnessing it. In the name of adults and their rights and their needs, we are making a fundamental, definitive separation between the idea of marriage and the idea of the mother and father who make the child, raising the child together, as being at all related to our public culture of marriage. And I think that's going to hurt a lot of people, including a lot of children. I don't think it's going to be good for gay people who depend, as the rest of us do, on a reasonably well-functioning marriage culture. I find it really difficult to imagine reviving and strengthening marriage when our government is insisting that our marriage tradition and the ideals which animated it are now merely